Hello, everyone. This is Keith Stone. I'm here with Gregory, Nagy, and Sarah, and Elen, and Janet. We're here for HeroesX Office Hours, version 10 of HeroesX. And the hours that we're discussing today are 16 and 17. And the questions are, if you were attending the first performance of the Agamemnon of Aeschylus in 458 BCE, would you need the background that you get from hearing about Agamemnon in a performance of the Iliad? And for 17, the Furies are on whose side, really, in the Libation Bearers of Aeschylus? And what about in the Eumenides of Aeschylus? All right, so that first one. Does the Iliad tell us the background that we need for the Aeschylus, or the Agamemnon of Aeschylus? What were folks saying about this one?
There is a good question from one participant. He's wondering about the background. Would someone during the classical period would be able to hear Homeric poetry? So I think that it's interesting to note that the Odeon, the place where Homeric poetry was recited, was close to the Dionysus theater.
Right next to it. Right next to it. Yes. And
so, yeah, go ahead.
So the question is, if I'm getting this right,
yes,
that, or whether the people who were there for the performance of the Agamemnon would in fact have heard performances of the Iliad.
And I definitely think they would have, because after all, Homeric poetry was primarily performed as a state occasion. And in the classical period, the venue seems to have been the theater known as the Odeum of Pericles. Odeum just means auditorium in ancient Greek. So that would be happening in late August, the performance of the Iliad and the Odyssey on a large scale every 4 years, but maybe it would have been performed on a small scale even in other years. But in any case, that's August. And then early spring, the city Dionysia would be the venue for the performances of tragedies. And the venue in that case is right next to the Odeum of Pericles. But it's not so much that I want to insist that these venues are next to each other physically, but more importantly, they're both part of the program, so to speak, of the state of Athens. And these performances are civic performances, not for private audiences, paying audiences, elite audiences, or anything of the sort. It's a function of the state to present in the middle of the 5th century, both the Iliad and the Odyssey in late summer, and tragedy early spring. In the case of tragedy, we know that's every year. And so, as far as I can see, when there are references to the horrific vision of what it would be like if dogs and birds were eating the corpse of a fallen warrior, the fact that Aeschylus uses that kind of expression, not the same way exactly as we see it in the Iliad, but in a very similar way, which suggests to me that this is all a common repertoire. I'm pronouncing repertoire in the Anglo way, and I offer my excuses to Elen, because I know it would be pronounced differently in French.
One of the participants is talking about that the way that Homeric poetry has, as it were, kept alive things about the civilization, whether Agamemnon had been a real Mycenaean king or not, had kept alive those stories, and without that oral tradition and those performances, by the time we'd reached the era of Aeschylus, there would have perhaps so much of that would have been lost. He wouldn't have had anything to start with, I guess.
And so, dear Sarah, how did you react to that?
Well, I think that's a good point, because if those stories hadn't been continued in the Homeric tradition, where would Aeschylus have, what would his starting point have been if all of that had been lost?
Exactly, yeah. But I still like the way in the Agamemnon, there is a retelling of the Iliad in that beginning of the choral riff, of that very long choral passage, all about the fact that it's a 10-year-old thing, who are the leaders, where are they from. It does have this wonderful recap quality, but for me, that doesn't presuppose that people don't know that. It's just the way in some rhapsodies, there's a recap of what happened in the previous rhapsody.
I mean, in a culture that has multiform stories, it might be a handy way for the author to indicate which traditions he's working with in this particular telling.
In respect of those different traditions, I know you asked about the Iliad, but I was also thinking about the Odyssey. And Menelaus and Agamemnon both tell us something about how Agamemnon met his end, and that's a slightly different version. He dies at a feast, I think, rather than in the bath.
Yes, it's true. And not only that, but it's a kind of perverted feast. Well, obviously, it's a perverted feast if one of the feasters is killed at the feast. But I love the expression "bous epiphatne," which means an ox that is eating at its feeding station. You're not supposed to sacrifice an ox while it is not actually prepared for the sacrifice, so to speak. So it's even if you look at it in terms of the language of sacrificing an ox rather than murdering a human, it's still incorrect. So there are all sorts of beautiful things going on in Aeschylus's reception of whole tradition. And the fact that they're different has, I think, a lot to do with Aeschylus as being very aware of the politics at the time. For him, it's very important that Agamemnon and Menelaus be thought of as the twin kings of Argos, because in 458, Athens in that era happened to be allied closely with the city of Argos. There would be other versions where the role of Sparta would be much more important, but not in this one. And I'm so glad that you, Sarah, brought up the allusions to the death of Agamemnon in Odyssey 3 and then more directly in Odyssey 4, because there it's very clear that the Homeric version is much more political than Aeschylus's version in exactly where Agamemnon landed, where the murder happened, etc. Simply because even the point of landing was in territory that was contested between the state of Sparta and the state of Argos. So as usual, Homeric poetry is very political. Well, so is Athenian tragedy, the poetry of Athenian tragedy. But I would almost say that the poetry of Homer is more ecumenical. So interesting, and it shows how myth, sure, it's a society's way of expressing truth values for one society, but what happens when you have a synthesis of myths and where there's a political need to highlight what is similar and to shade over what is different? Well, that's Homeric poetry in its essence. And yes, there are differences, maybe not so noticeable, but there are differences.
Can we say if Homeric poetry is providing a background information that is Pan-Hellenic, and tragedies are providing more Athenian view, and they are zooming in Homeric poetry?
I would say that's definitely a good formulation. I would add just one little tweak, which is that, yes, the Athenian version, as we see it in Aeschylus's set of dramas, is more overtly Athenian in orientation. But I would want to add that it's still pretending to be Pan-Hellenic. And another good example is the poetry of Pindar, who flourished in the first half of the 5th century. Pindar's songs definitely plug into all sorts of local traditions that glorify primarily one site at the expense of another site. But it happens in a way that still seems very Pan-Hellenic. The program is to glorify your own place, but to make it seem as if everybody else accepts it. So there's still a lot of shading over of differences and highlighting of similarities. But I'm saying, but I'm saying that in a sense, I use the word ecumenical, that Homeric poetry, when you compare the two, that is to say, Homer and Aeschylus, Homeric poetry is more ecumenical, even though it's older. And even though it too has a very strong Athenian phase of transmission, shall we say.
Well, let's go to the other question.
Yes, I think we better, because I just love the way myth and politics go together. And I could talk forever, but it's time to talk about the Furies.
Well, it's possible we'll get more of that. The Furies are on whose side, really, in the Libation Bearers, and then separately in the Eumenides?
Yes.
Whose side are they on?
And before I try to be persuasive about how I think about it, let's talk a little bit about the reactions of our participants. Whether they were at peace with this question or whether they thought it was provocative.
I think they've been giving it some good serious thought here, trying to analyse, what the role of the Furies is. For example, in Libation Bearers, the connection with trying to get revenge on behalf of Clytemnestra. Mm-hmm. So are they more closely affiliated with the mother in a way that maybe we don't see so much happening at the end of the Eumenides?
Excellent. And I think there's a very strong strain of that in especially the Libation Bearers. And in a sense, the take of Electra and the take of Clytemnestra are both, how shall I say it, justifiable takes when it comes to what the Furies are all about. The Erinyes are simply vengeful spirits that will approve of any eye for eye, tooth for tooth retribution. After all, they're like bloodhounds. If human blood is spilled, then they're there to track it down and to make sure that the spilling of blood is punished, no matter who does the inflicting and no matter which side says, oh, our side is right or our side is right. It doesn't matter. It's the spilling of the blood itself.
Right, so it's not a case of right or wrong so much as
No.
who they want to get vengeance for.
And what's interesting is, okay, I take vengeance, therefore I claim my rights, but then the next person will claim their rights when they take vengeance against you. And it's this endless sequence of, to use that wonderful Italian word, vendetta, which comes from Latin vindicta, as in vindictive, which is the way we borrow the word in English.
Yeah, they seem to keep changing sides or moving down the chain of evil as different people are improperly sacrificed in the story of this family.
Yes. And that's why I really love that that fable towards the beginning of the, well, it's not at the beginning, but it's still well into the Agamemnon, the drama Agamemnon. The fable as sung and danced by the chorus about the young lion that is adopted by a royal family and that is raised by the family, but then true to the lion's nature, which just wants to kill and eat raw meat, will go out of control even when the lion is trying to be civilized. Gee, Mom and Dad, I'm so grateful to you for adopting me when I was a child, a cub, and I'm going to throw a party for you. But once the slaughtering of the sheep starts, then the blood just takes over, and presumably the royal family also gets slaughtered. I think that's the implication of that fable is lions are true to their nature. They crave blood. The Furies, the Erinyes, are true to their nature. They track down blood and they make sure that whoever spilled the blood will have their own blood spilled, and it goes on forever.
Not something you can have in an organized, civilized polis.
No. And that's the beauty, of course, of the set of three tragedies together, is that the city of Athens goes beyond this. It leaves behind the bloody heroic age of vendetta, and now there's rule of law. And how shall I say it? Heroes are domesticated after death.
And the negotiation of this done by Athena,
Yes.
wells beautifully.
Yes, and what a perfect agent for a new era, a new phase of human existence, where we're through with vendetta. It's now rule of law. It doesn't mean that you don't punish for blood spilled. And in fact, think of the fact that even in Athenian law, in the era of the democracy, a prosecutor is called literally a pursuer, and a defendant is literally the one who flees. So it's still, shall we say, the bloodhound tracking down the perpetrator. It's just that it's now controlled by an overarching presence, which is civilization, which can only happen when the city happens. The city can only happen when Athena invents trial by jury. It's amazing.
One of the participants has described it as they move from being rather one-sided
Yes.
to being more two-sided.
Yes.
How would you?
It's absolutely, it's beautifully put. And I used to joke. In fact, I think, Sarah, when you and I were standing in front of the cave of the Furies, at the ground zero of the Areopagus just a few months ago, and I'm reminiscing about the time that Sarah and I were both participating in a travel study program, and there we were after we finished climbing up to the Acropolis and then coming down from the Acropolis, and there we are facing the hill of Ares, and then we look to the side, and there is the cave of the Furies, the Erinyes. I was describing, I think, the whole setup, that is to say, the cave of the Furies down there, and then the overall overarching presence of Athena as a condominium, so to speak, of the old world of heroes and the new world where the dysfunctional aspects of what happened in the heroic age are purged, are purified, but the functional aspects of the need for justice to be done are kept, but in an Olympian kind of overarchingly celestial way, let's put it that way.
I suppose Athena is in charge of the condo association.
She certainly is.
In this case.
She is in charge. I love the way people notice that she says, I'm the gardener.
Right. That's right.
I'm the gardener, which is like, again, a kind of revisiting of the Garden of Laertes, isn't it? That when all the vendetta is over, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's not say when the vendetta is over, but let's just say that the garden is an alternative to continuing vendetta. I think that's a better way to say it.
Yeah. And Furies will be honored with good intentions.
Exactly, good intentions. And presto, we have the Eumenides instead of the Erinyes, which is a wonderful euphemism because we want to think euphemistically. There's still going to be dark sides to crime and punishment. So Dostoevsky lives, but the crime and punishment is administered within civilization.
Anything else we ought to talk about before we have our parting thoughts? All right. Well, it's been a pleasure once again, all of you.
Well, it's always a joy for me. Thank you all. And thanks to the participants for sticking with us and not being too irritated by my questions.
Okay. See you next time.
Bye.